Hi, welcome to session number 2 of How to Improvise. During this session, this is going to be a little bit more technical in nature. We're going to talk a little bit about jazz scales and how to practice jazz scales. Okay, major scales we should be familiar with at least to some extent by the time we start improvising. Major scales are obviously the basis for everything else. Now, what I want to say about major scales is that most people learn scales by starting at the bottom and going to the top. That's necessary because you need to learn the notes of the scale, and that's a necessary first step. The reason we need to go beyond that is because when we're improvising, if we keep orienting ourselves down to the bottom of the scale, it kind of hurts the continuity of our line. It makes our improvisations kind of chunky. So we need to get used to not just playing up and down a scale, but we need to get used to playing in this key. Okay? Playing in this key means, can I start anywhere in this scale and play? In other words, can you plop in the middle of the scale and still play in this key? In other words, what I just did is I started in the middle of this scale on this C, and I played down to that F, and then I kept going all the way down to the C below that. Okay? And all those notes that I played are in this key or part of this scale in different octaves. Okay? One of the ways to help yourself, to train yourself, to get used to doing that sort of thing, is to take this scale apart into little pieces and move up and down it what we call modally. And what I mean by that is 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 4, 3, 4, 5, 4, 5, 6. Okay? That helps us get used to starting and stopping in the middle of the scale. Okay? So figure out we're in the key of F major. So if you're a trumpet player or a tenor player, you're starting on a G. You're in G major. If you're an alto player, you're starting on a D. You're in D major. Okay? Let's set the metronome and play this concert F scale just like I just sang it. Working our way up and down like that. Now, I have the G at the top in parentheses, sorry. I have the G at the top in parentheses because we'll play that as part of this pattern, okay? But first off, I wanted you to just visualize the F scale from F to F, okay? Adding this note at the top, that's exactly the kind of thing that we do when we practice this scale in kind of in the sense of learning how to improvise, okay? So join me on this scale. 1, 2, 3, 1, 3. So that's the pattern that I want to do. I also added an E right there on the way down. Da da, went down another note, back to that F. And that's really the point, is to not feel like we're at some sort of starting point or ending point when we get to this F or to this F, that we can go in each direction. Okay? So that's a good exercise to do on every scale, is to modally work your way through those scales so that you feel like you're playing in the key of F, not just on an F scale. All right? So we want to do that in a bunch of different keys. Well, my point that I want to make about that is keep in mind that it seems like a daunting task to do all of these things in 12 different keys. It's a daunting task to learn all 12 major scales sometimes, all 12 minor scales, all that sort of thing. Keep in mind that you don't need to learn 12 all at once. You can learn them in chunks if this is difficult for you. If it's new to you, learn a few keys and then just keep building on new ones all the time. I didn't learn all 12 scales in one day. I learned them bit by bit. Okay? I had a sheet where they were written down. I started just playing through them every day. And I read those scales for months and months, I don't know, long time. And then eventually, I just didn't need the sheet anymore because I had played them a lot. And that's a good way to do it. But keep in mind that you don't need to learn everything all at once. You can learn it bit by bit. Okay? Then the next part of that same, I want to take that same pattern and apply it to a different scale. Okay? A dominant seventh scale is this same F scale, but with the seventh note of the scale taken down a half step. Okay? So now we're going to play all the same notes that we just did, except these E's at the top are going to be E flats instead of E naturals. So think through that for just a second. If you're a B flat instrument, okay, we're making that F sharp. What was an F sharp and F natural? And if you're an E flat instrument, an alto sax player, you're taking a C sharp and making it a C natural. So I want to play that same pattern, but use the dominant seventh form of the scale. 1, 2, 3, 1, there. Now, this E flat translated into an E flat down here, okay? So it sounds a little bit weird, but don't be afraid of that. That's the way it's going to sound, okay? Always think of all these notes as being all the way through the range of your instrument, okay? Not just in this octave, okay? So this is one way to practice scales, to take a scale like in starting on F and do different forms of it. Okay? The third form that we're going to touch on today is Dorian minor. It took me a long time to figure this out. When I was a kid, and I was getting interested in jazz, I kept hearing people talk about Dorian minor scales. And I always wondered why they needed the word Dorian. Why didn't they just call them minor scales? And it took me a long time to lay my eyes on that information. Basically, like, there's lots of different kinds of minor scales, and Dorian minor is just one of them. The type of minor scale that we usually use when we're playing jazz is this thing called a Dorian minor scale. And we can create a Dorian minor scale by just taking this exact scale that we were just playing, and now we're going to take the third note of the scale and move that down a half a step. Move that down half a step. So trumpet players, you would be playing a B flat instead of a B natural. And altos, you would be playing a F natural instead of an F sharp. Okay? So we're going to take that same pattern and play it in Dorian minor. 1, 2, 3, 1. Do is take that same idea and just move through two other keys just to give, to just start working on it. So let's take this all down a whole step. Let's go to E flat concert. Let's go to E flat concert. Let's play that same pattern in major. Then we'll stop for a couple bars. The same pattern in dominant seventh. The same pattern in Dorian minor. On E flat concert, so figure out what key you're in. 1, 2, 3, 1, 0. Dominant seventh, so think about the seventh note of that scale. And we're going to move it down a half step. 1, 2, 3, 1, 0. Weird sounding, isn't it? Now, same thing, Dorian minor. So we're going to flat the third note of that scale. Well, 1, 2, 3, 1, 1. Then let's do the same thing in the key of G concert. G concert. Okay, so G major, the G dominant 7th, and then G Dorian minor. 1, 2, 3, 1, turn that into a dominant 7th. 1, 2, 3, 1, 1. Dorian minor, so figure out the third note of that scale, bring it down half a step. 1, 2, 3, 1, 1. Good. Now, part of the reason that those scales, especially the dominant 7th and the Dorian minor versions of it, the reason that they sound a little weird in this format is because they actually are drawn from other keys. Okay? So these only go together because they all use the same root. And it's just one way of thinking about scales. There's lots of different ways of thinking about scales. This is kind of the way I learned them when I was young because it kind of made sense to me. And like I said, it's just one way. It's maybe the least complicated way in terms of just figuring out what notes that you're playing. The important part here is just moving around in these keys and being able to start in the middle of the scale, being able to go above the top note of the scale, below the bottom note of the scale. Thanks for listening.